Do perfumes expire, and just how long is it before they go off? These are two very important questions if you have a larger perfume collection. Even if you have 10 bottles of perfume or more, I would say these are very important questions. Nobody wants to spend money on fragrance to then have it expire on them. And actually, some people have a very nostalgic link with their fragrances and really want to maintain those smells for their future because they just link with memories and take them somewhere when they smell them. So do fragrances expire, and how can you tell if your fragrances have expired? Also, how can you best maintain your fragrances to give them as long a lifetime as possible? I'm Claire Smith and I make videos all about perfume and perfume science, so if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing, and also please like this video if you do enjoy this kind of content. So firstly, is the concept of a fragrance going off completely ridiculous? Some people might say that it is. Some people collect vintage fragrances and see nothing wrong with smelling fragrances that are 50 or close to 100 years old. They just think they smell amazing. I personally have experienced a fragrance going off, so I know that fragrances expire. But fragrances, even if they don't actually expire, do change over their lifetimes because there are chemical reactions that happen within that fragrance over its lifetime. And that's what changes the fragrance's scent. Your views on this topic are going to be dependent on your own experiences and also on your tolerance levels. Different people have different tolerance levels for what they deem to be off. The other extreme to the vintage fragrance collectors are the people who have expiry date paranoia. So some people won't buy fragrances from discounters because they believe that the discounters get fragrances that are already old. And actually, a way to check the age of your fragrance is to use something like Check Fresh. You can find little batch numbers on the bottoms of bottles or on the backs of boxes, and you can usually look those codes up on Check Fresh and see how old your fragrance is. Often codes repeat every 10 years, so you may have to do a bit of detective work, perhaps with the address of the fragrance company if you have that on the box to be able to date your bottle. But ultimately, you should be able to have a guesstimate about how old your fragrance is using the batch codes. You may have already noticed as well that modern fragrance bottles now have period after opening symbols, so open jar symbols on the bottom of their bottles. And these symbols indicate the longest lifetime that the manufacturer guarantees the fragrance to be fresh for. Because these symbols were first created for the cosmetics industry, the symbols are only valid up to 36 months. So that's the longest period after opening symbol you are ever going to see on any product. This means that it's not really appropriate for fragrance because often fragrances will last much, much longer than 3 years. But that is really the maximum period after opening date you are going to see on the bottom of a fragrance. So actually, even though it says 36 months and your manufacturer is guaranteeing that fragrance to be fresh for 36 months, it does not mean that that fragrance will not be fresh beyond 36 months. However, the truth is that as soon as a fragrance is made, it begins to degrade. And also when you spray that fragrance, that also accelerates the process of the degradation. Of course, degradation can happen very, very slowly for fragrances. It doesn't have to be even over months, it could be over years or even over decades, depending upon how it's been stored. But the process of degradation is going on with that fragrance from the moment it's made. So what happens when a fragrance goes off? How can you tell? Well, you just have to sniff it. It will smell different. Some people will tell you that the fragrance changing colour can be a warning as to the fragrance going off, but actually some fragrances contain notes that actually just naturally change in colour anyway as they age. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're off, it just means they're older, or they've been exposed to certain light conditions or certain heat conditions. So for example, vanilla is a notorious fragrance note for darkening fragrance. And here, my Kayali Vanilla 28, I think has definitely got darker since I've owned this bottle. It's just something that happens. It doesn't necessarily mean that the fragrance, because it's darker, is off. Think of people with Mugler Alien Essence Absolute. Just because that fragrance is super, super dark, it doesn't mean that they're going to throw it away. Another fragrance that notoriously darkens over time is Aquilina's Pink Sugar, and again that has vanilla in it. So you can see that actually a lot of fragrances do darken over time and it's nothing to worry about. What you should be worrying about is how the fragrance smells. So any change to the smell can be indicative that a fragrance can be significantly degrading. But actually even changes in potency, so how strong a fragrance is, whether it's getting weaker or whether it's getting stronger, can also indicate degradation. But if that doesn't bother you, there's no problem, is there? So really the biggest thing is, has the smell of the fragrance itself changed? I've had a few fragrances that have been off actually, and the first one that I ever experienced was Davidoff Cool Water Woman. That one I got second hand from somebody else, and I remember the first time I sprayed it, it just smelled like plastic. I have never smelled a fragrance that was off before, and I just instantaneously knew that it was off, because it just wasn't how it smelled in the shop. It was nothing even remotely close to how Davidoff Cool Water Woman should smell. And also I've experienced it with other fragrances. So there was another fragrance I had, Burberry Touch, and this fragrance, the top notes seemed a little bit off. But actually when the fragrance had dried down, it then became more normal. And I think that's really the sign that the fragrance is heading out the door. That's the sign that you need to use that fragrance up. You need to speed up your usage to be able to get through the bottle. And that's what I did. But yeah, that's like the earlier stage of a fragrance going off, when the top notes only are affected. And that can be, certain top notes are more easily affected than others. So things like Rena notes, floral notes, citrus notes in particular are very, very easily affected. So that's also something to look out for. The top notes just smelling a bit weird. The top notes are often the first to go because they're somehow more susceptible to oxidation. I guess they're smaller molecules, they're lighter molecules, they're probably more reactive molecules in some way. And so they're just more susceptible to being oxidised by oxygen in the fragrance bottle. So which fragrances are the more likely ones to go off? Well, bad news, it's probably the pricier ones. Well, it's the ones that have the higher concentrations of perfume oil. So things like extraits, things like eau de parfums rather than eau de toilettes or eau de colognes. Also alcohol-free fragrances like hair mists are also more likely to go off, and this is because alcohol, amongst other uses, is actually used as a preservative. It's great at excluding air and water from perfume oils, which helps the perfume oils to be protected and to last and to be in better condition for longer. So if you want a fragrance that will last in the longer term, you want to look for a higher alcohol content. So things like eau de colognes and eau de toilettes are going to last a lot longer than higher perfume oil concentration fragrances. So which fragrances in your collection should you check and worry about more than others? Well, it's going to be the ones that, for example, like oil perfumery fragrances that are oil-based. These are also rollables, so that means they're even more susceptible to degradation, because each time you're applying these, the rollable is meaning that stuff is going to be picked up from your skin and transferred into the fragrance. And that means that the fragrance is going to be more susceptible to degradation anyway, because it's going to have bacteria getting into the fragrance itself. So yeah, rollables, including this one from Kayali, are problematic. And actually you can solve this issue by simply decanting the fragrance. You can often just pop the rollable off using the end of the lid, and you can transfer it into an atomizer. And okay, that's going to mean that the fragrance is exposed to air, but it may be better than the fragrance being repeatedly exposed to bacteria from your skin. That may help to preserve it. So yeah, rollables and oil perfumes should definitely be the ones that you're looking at and checking to see whether they're still good. Similarly, splash bottles have those issues as well. So if you're applying a fragrance directly to your skin from a splash bottle, then there's going to be stuff from your skin going back into the fragrance, which can be something that can cause it to degrade quicker than any other types of spray fragrance. So yeah, these little minis are particularly problematic as well, and the larger bottles of splashes. So I think Chanel used to make splashes, and a lot of men's fragrances still come in splash bottles. So yeah, these are things that you should also be looking at. Additionally, if you're into natural and so-called clean fragrances, then those fragrances may be more susceptible to degradation than other fragrances. And that's because those fragrances often don't have added preservatives. So fragrances these days generally have a UV filter added to them. So some kind of chemical to act as a sunscreen is actually added to the fragrance, much like you would add sunscreen to your skin before going out in the sun in the summer. It's something that's actually really useful to try to extend the life of fragrances and can really help to reduce the amount of light damage from sun exposure. Often clean fragrances rely on more natural sunscreens, so the non-chemically synthesized sunscreens, so things like vitamin E, which just acts as an antioxidant. These are not sunscreens in themselves really, they are things that just act as protective molecules for the free radicals that are generated by UV exposure, rather than actually screening out the UV in the first place. So in that way, the fragrances just aren't as well protected, and so these fragrances will degrade a bit faster than other fragrances which have better preservatives. Bottle design is something that also has a huge impact on how quickly fragrances may degrade. So bottles that don't have a separate cap, for instance, may be more susceptible to degradation than those with a separate cap. And that's because caps mean that there's less air exchange with the nozzle. And so the fragrance is actually exposed to less oxygen and is therefore less susceptible to oxidation. So for example, fragrances like Gucci Rush, where there's no cap and there's an open atomizer, may be much more susceptible to degradation than fragrances with caps. Also, fragrances that are in mirrored bottles. So fragrances like Narciso Poudre, which from Narciso Rodriguez, these bottles have a mirrored inner lining, which means that there is very little light exposure to the fragrance itself, and which means that the fragrances are much more likely to have a longer lifespan than something in a clear bottle, for example. You can kind of compare how fragrances are stored to how wines are stored. So how would you store a red or a white wine? You would probably put it in a green or a brown glass bottle if you wanted it to keep well. You would also keep it out of the light. It's exactly the same with fragrance. Another type of fragrance storage that is more likely to result in the fragrance going off is the fragrance decant. So, you know, people are lovely and they send you these decants, but you know that they are subject to far more air exposure than a normal decant made in a factory, for example, or a normal bottle. And that's because these are not airtight. These are not factory sealed in any way. And so the fragrance itself is exposed to more air, which means it's more likely to go off in a shorter period of time. So it's a great idea to use these up as fast as possible and to enjoy them and not to hoard them. Finally, the fragrance notes themselves are going to determine how well a fragrance keeps. So for example, fragrances with heavier, woodier or balsamic base notes are going to keep much better than fragrances that are based around very sparkly top notes such as citrus or green notes or really light florals. This is because those much heavier base note molecules are less susceptible to oxidation and they are less likely to evaporate. And even if they do evaporate, the fragrance just gets a little bit deeper, a little bit stronger. It doesn't really change in its fragrance. Whereas citrus, aromatic and light floral fragrances are just more susceptible to oxidation generally and should be treated as fragrances with very short shelf lives. So what can you do to slow down the process of perfume degradation? Well, you should think about how you store your fragrances. You've probably seen other videos about this already, so I'm not going to labour the points. But basically there are a couple of major things that you should look out for. So the first factor is light exposure. So if possible, keep your fragrances in their original boxes. I know that's boring, I know they don't look pretty, but your fragrances will keep so much longer in the box as opposed to outside, especially if your room is quite light. I keep my fragrances around a corner in my room, so actually they don't get much light exposure, and they're also on top of a dark surface. So hopefully I'm okay. But really, with the number of fragrances that I have, I should probably keep some of them at least in the boxes. But I just don't, because I like to be able to reach for them easily and to have the full selection out, because I know that if I put them away, I'm just not going to reach for them. I guess a way of getting around having some of them in the boxes some of the time would be to do fragrance rotations. So you could put maybe your summer fragrances away in the winter when you know you're not going to want a light summer freshie. then what's the point in having it out on display? So yeah, think about where you store your fragrances as well. Keep them away from light sources, keep them away from windows, for example, or strong electric lights. But really, windows are the killers. Sunlight is so much more powerful than any electric light. So definitely keep your fragrances away from sunlight. The next thing is temperature. Just think about the constancy and also the level of temperature of where you keep your fragrances. Are your fragrances stored away from heat sources? So are they stored well away from things like radiators? Are they stored away from windows again, because sunlight does have heating properties? Ideally, for long-term storage, you probably want to keep your fragrances below 15 degrees Celsius, perhaps even below 10 degrees Celsius. But if you're using them regularly, then you don't want to have that constant change of temperature where you're taking them in and out of the fridge. I'd say really keeping them in just out of the light in somewhere cool that's a pretty constant temperature, but not necessarily a fridge, is probably the best option. Another thing you want to think about is the humidity. So really the worst place of all that you could store your fragrances is the bathroom, because in a bathroom, fragrances are going to be exposed to constantly changing temperature and humidity. And that on and off of the shower or the drawing of baths is going to cause huge changes in the humidity, and it's really not going to be great for your fragrances. Another thing that might sound really super weird is that I try not to disturb my fragrances. I'm not saying, I kind of talk to them, etc., and try to keep them at peace, but I don't want to shake my fragrances up, because shaking fragrances is going to accelerate any kind of chemical reactions within the fragrance. It's also going to distribute oxygen throughout the fragrance that's in the air that's within the bottle. And that is just not good. So when you think about a fragrance, the only part of the fragrance that is exposed to oxygen, if you don't shake it, is the top surface. And that means that the rest of the fragrance, in the volume of the fragrance, is protected from oxidation. So actually, even traveling with fragrances can be damaging to them, because in that way you're shaking them up. Every time they move, they are shaking a little bit and they're redistributing across the bottle. Every time you pick the fragrance up is actually an opportunity for that fragrance to potentially be oxidized in some way. It's really weird, because I've even seen people say that fragrances smell better after they shake them on YouTube, and I just hang my head in my hands and think, oh no, please don't shake that fragrance up. You're just going to ruin your fragrances in the long term. And really, you just need to compare your fragrance with any other chemical reaction. What do you do to speed up chemical reactions? You agitate them and you heat them up. And giving them energy from light as well is also a way to speed up chemical reactions. So really, you just need to think of your fragrance as some very finely balanced chemical reaction that you're trying to prevent from happening. A final factor you need to think about with fragrance is just how much is left in the bottle. So if you've got a bottle where you've used the majority of the fragrance, so for example, Toy 2 by Moschino, I've had for a while now, and if you look at this bottle, there really isn't that much left. But when you think about the surface area relative to the volume, as this fragrance gets used up, the surface area stays the same, but the volume decreases, which means that the ratio between the two increases. And that means that the fragrance is subject to more exposure to oxygen within this bottle, which means that the fragrance itself is more susceptible to oxidation and may go off faster. So really, when you've used up this amount of fragrance in a bottle like this, you shouldn't linger. You shouldn't leave this fragrance unless there's nostalgic reasons, unless you're prepared for that fragrance to potentially go off. Because ultimately, any kind of effect of oxidation is going to have a greater effect on this smaller volume of fragrance than when the fragrance volume was much larger. So yeah, don't linger. So if a fragrance has been open for longer than 3 years, when the period after opening date on a fragrance says 36 months, is it still safe to use? Well, yes, it should be. The period after opening date guarantees the safe period of usage of that fragrance, but it doesn't mean that it will go off instantaneously after 3 years. If you still enjoy the fragrance smell, then I would continue to use it. The only concern is that some oxidation and breakdown products of fragrances can cause skin irritation. So if you are someone with very sensitive skin, you may have some issues after that period. But ultimately, it's down to personal choice. You just need to try the fragrance and see whether there is any effect on your skin. And if there is, then just discontinue usage. If there isn't, then you're good to go. Another thing to be aware of is that older fragrances may have darkened due to evaporation and also due to changes in notes, for example, vanilla. And that may mean that you may wish to spray those fragrances away from clothing because they may be more likely to stain clothing. I guess ultimately, if you enjoy the smell of the fragrance but are just a bit concerned about it being a little bit older, then you perhaps could use the fragrance in alternative ways. So for example, you could end up spraying the fragrance as a room spray or as a bed freshener, something where the fragrance is not directly going on your skin. And that may be a better or safer way to use up that fragrance for you. Finally, if a fragrance has gone off, what can you do? Well, it depends just how badly it's gone off. I guess some people can tolerate to a certain extent when top notes have gone off. But if the fragrance really has gone off, there's really no alternative other than to throw it away. And ultimately, nobody really wants to throw anything in the general waste. People want to recycle fragrances. From doing some research on fragrance recycling, I have not seen any kind of scheme that takes back bottles with fragrance in them. So really, what you have to do is spray the fragrance out of the bottle or remove the atomizer and actually empty the bottles. And from my own experience of spraying expired fragrances, they absolutely stink. You do not want to be anywhere near an expired fragrance. So if you are going to spray the fragrance, I would do it outside because it will just smell your house out for days. Recycling schemes in the UK, such as the Boots recycling scheme, the John Lewis recycling scheme, and the L'Occitane recycling scheme, will not take fragrance bottles, even if they're empty actually. The only fragrance recycling scheme that I've found in the UK is one from the Perfume shop. So the Perfume shop will take empty fragrance bottles. Another alternative is that you check your local council recycling schemes because some councils will take fragrance bottles, but you often need to remove the atomizer because the atomizer is deemed to be contaminating waste in glass streams. So it's just very hard to recycle fragrance bottles. It's really quite annoying to recycle fragrance bottles. I really think the industry needs to think about how the fragrance bottle waste is to be dealt with because it's really one of the last things in recycling that's really not being dealt with, isn't it? I think it really needs to be thought about. So thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, then please press the like button and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please let me know, have you ever had a fragrance expire on you? Did you know immediately or did it take some time for you to work it out? How do you store your fragrances? How do you maintain them over a long period of time? I'd be really interested to know. And thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.